So we'll do strip malls, big box, and high rise. Today it's a lot of information. The PowerPoint's really pretty basic, so we're looking for you guys to ask questions. We'll try and add some additional information as we go through this, and at least give you a good foundation or starting point for when you're riding in the front seat. You've got to make these decisions. And this call comes in your first due area. So
there's a ton on Norman's that has, strip malls and commercials, big box, high rise, but your cheat sheet is your accepted practice, and we're in the process of updating the high rise one, but for the most part the strip mall and commercial is going to stay the same. So we'll talk about what we can, where we see the high rise policy going, some stuff that's definite, but some stuff is still up in the air right now. But just that's kind of your cheat sheet as an officer, acting officer, is go to those accepted practices, know where you need to be first due, where you might need to be second due engine, first due truck, second due truck, and that's what you can kind of fall back on when you're out in the field.
All right, so we're just going to start with strip malls. So basically with the strip malls, these are just the disposable buildings. Okay, they're built cheap. They're meant to be used for a few years, and then typically they either get knocked down or get a massive remodel and changed to another use. So we deal with the big open spaces inside these stores, usually maybe a small office. It's about and maybe a stock room in the back is about the only divisions that take place inside these units. And sometimes they're 2 or 3 bays wide depending on the size of the store. The cock lot, the space above the ceiling here, almost always runs end to end. And every one that I've ever been in that we've popped the ceiling on and looked, if there are any kind of dividers in there, they've been destroyed by by plumbing or electrical or HVAC or something, where they've just gone in there and knocked a hole in it and put through the new cable or data cable or whatever they're messing with up there. So you really can't count on any kind of lateral spread protection in these. Higher ceilings than residential, typically not much higher than what we're dealing with here in a strip mall, but still higher than a residential. And then obviously you almost always have a drop ceiling, and sometimes you'll have multiple ceilings above that. Okay. High fire loads, especially when you look at different places, especially up north. Some of those stores, like along Colfax, some of those you can barely walk through. So they have a huge fire load with that. Okay. And then the lightweight truss construction for the roof support. And then this is a big one with the type of occupancy. We really don't know what we're going to walk into. A lot of these stores, you may have a clothing store one week, it may be auto supply the next, or a mixture of both, depending on the type of store, or with the pawn shops and the thrift stores and stuff, they have just a massive variety of stock in there, and it's always changing, always rotating. So if you've been in there last week doing a pre-plan, you may come in this week and face something. Where are we going to run into access issues usually in these? Okay, so yeah, it's going to be that alley or that back entrance. It's something I didn't realize until I was in Nines area. Per fire code, and I believe it's somewhere around 70 or 80 feet. If it's 70 or 80 feet or less in depth, they don't even have to have a back entrance. They can have one exit to the store, which is going to be that main front store or front entrance. So be aware of that on some of the smaller strip malls. Pictures right there at Chambers in Mexico is an example of that strip mall there. They don't have any back doors. All in there. So. Okay, so some of this is a little bit repetitive. Sorry about that. So we kind of talked about this, just that the open spaces and the construction really lends itself to that lateral spread if this fire is allowed to move and progress. Something we touched on most Any
Kind of the same
questions?
thing with, we talked about Monday with the restaurants. If there's a huge fire in these, they're just tearing it down. I mean, if we make a stop and there's 8 units left to the Delta side, then they can probably stop. They can stop it there, rebuild it. But again, it comes to that, and we'll talk about today, value times size. How much value is in these things? Not that much if they start burning up. If there's no life hazard in there, then try to make a stop on it. That's why we move down. We write a unit off and we move down to, say, a Delta 1 or Delta 2 exposure, Bravo 1 and Bravo 2, because then it's just going to keep rebuilt.
For those of you who've been in Aurora for 10 years or so, Iliff and Chambers, there they built that new car wash, big fancy freestanding car wash place. That actually used to be part of that strip mall, and 20 years ago or something, they had a pretty good fire in there. And they just went down to where they needed to in the strip mall and demoed everything that was damaged, and then you just had the end of the strip mall just got moved over, and they just left it empty for a while until another developer came in. Okay, so since you can't assume, but we basically know some pretty straightforward things about these. They are put up pretty cheap and easy. They may be type 2, type 3, or type 5 construction, and anymore, some hybrid of those may be a possibility too. Typically, anything that's been built in the last probably 10 years is going to be structural steel, and then they're going to infill between the structural steel components with either masonry or metal studs or maybe wood studs in there, and then you're going to have either wood or lightweight bar joist trusses across the top, almost 100%. So some of the older ones have those dividing walls that may be masonry, but that's a pretty expensive way to do construction now, so you'll see less and less of that. So what do we know based on that about the occupancies in terms of fire conditions?
Short amount of time if the members are exposed.
Okay, yeah, so these are going to fall down pretty quick under fire conditions, and it doesn't matter whether you've got wood trusses or bar joist trusses above you, they're all going to come down really fast. So you guys are all should be pretty familiar with the construction types, so none of this should be a surprise.
Not sure if it's covered in this one or not, but that's one thing with the trusses, especially in strip malls. I mean, that's where you want to get in there, pop that ceiling, and see the direction of them. So are they running Alpha to Charlie, or are they running Bravo to Delta? Because that's going to help you determine, okay, if for some reason we've got to risk a lot to get in. Yeah, I mean, you get what I'm saying? Like, if the trusses are running from Alpha to Charlie, so then if one fails, how's it going to collapse? It'll be kind of localized in that one area, right, front to back. So if you're in a Delta exposure, Bravo exposure, less of a concern, still a concern. But so if you're working in Delta Bravo exposure, but the trusses are running Bravo to Delta, if one goes, you could be more in the path. Does that make sense?
Is there like a hard fast rule where a lot of these strip malls, the long sides are going to be your structural support sides, or the shorter sides are going to be?
What I always answer that question is when we did the King Supers thing down with Parker, they had them running both ways.
Oh, really?
Right. Depending on where you're at in the building, it was running both ways. So King Supers was Alpha to Charlie, and the rest of the strip malls on the side, Bravo to Delta.
Okay.
So you just have to, it's just a matter of visualizing. And then that might not be reliable. It's like every unit you go into, you should visualize.
Okay.
Not just say one and then say that's the whole building. You never know what's been added on, or if that Delta 3 exposure is longer, then they might have changed the construction altogether.
So just to build kind of on the collapse stuff. So just think about this room. So if we had trusses running right to left in here, and you had a fire way in the back Your collapse is probably going to be isolated more towards the back, at least initially. So your ability to push into the front of the store and make a rescue or something is probably greater and a little bit safer for you. There's still sort of the risk of a domino effect if it's a system, and so if you use part of the system, kind of like a house of cards, it can come down. But the likelihood of it rapidly collapsing towards you would be less. If they're running front to back, you got a fire in the back of the room. It's exposing the truss that you're crawling underneath the first few feet going in the door. So your risk is going to be higher. And obviously you're going to have to make a decision on that based on survivability and how much risk you can afford to take. But so you can kind of think that way. The other thing that the front to back has more potential to do is push on those exterior walls. So if it's structural steel, probably less likely to have a collapse. It's still possible. If it's true masonry construction, as those trusses twist and pull and do stuff, you're more likely to have those walls. More like a warehouse, which we'll talk about later. Pressure on those exterior walls. Does that make sense? Talk a little bit about this. Usually your interior walls are going to be some kind of infill inside of a steel structure, unless they are true masonry construction.
We had that at Parker, at that decking supers, we had multiple drop ceilings too. So that's, you take one drop ceiling down and then there's another ceiling above it. So I think, it's clear up there. And yeah, actually, that's why one of those, 14, 16 foot pike poles really helps you in a case like that, because even if you go up as high as you can, see if you can pull anything down, see if there's anything above that first ceiling.
The cinder block interior walls, do we have as far as, because I'm thinking of like auto body type places, but those usually aren't in strip mall. I haven't seen anywhere there's the big cinder block interior walls.
Thinking more like for firewalls, like dividing, there's some pictures, I believe in this one, where you'll see that wall that extends up higher in a strip mall, and so
then I know that's a firewall.
most
Okay.
likely
So
that's
it won't
going
be
to be
between every unit necessarily, it could just be sectioned.
right.
Yeah, some of the older ones were built that way, and sometimes it's like every third bay or every fourth bay or something, and the strip mall will have a solid wall like that. It just kind of depends. So our type 3.
When you talk about the roof, one thing, not just on ordinary, but whether it's strip mall or whether it's commercial structure, and I think we'll talk about it more. We can even talk a little bit about it now, but vertical ventilation. What's the roof covered with? How long is it going to take to get to the roof, and how long is it going to take you to cut a hole? When you got to get through tar and gravel, and you got to get through insulation, you got to get through, sometimes 4 inches, sometimes a foot of insulation, and then you got to cut the decking, and then you got to figure out which way the trusses are going. It's at least a 10 to 15 minute job. So if you're on scene and it needs to happen, there may not be the opportunity for it to happen. How many people got down to either, we did it at Regatta, we did it at Parker, especially the one at Parker with the foam insulation, and you need both saws, and it's going to come up your saws, and it's a tough thing. So stuff to think about, especially on these commercial structures. Is it even a possibility?
Does everybody know what Cap's talking about in terms of the roof construction and how that works on what's called a flat roof?
They've got the corrugated decking, and then more times than not, it'll come where they'll have the foam insulation, and it could be this far off, it could be this far off. And then on top of that, they'll usually lay some tar and gravel or some sort of covering over it, rubber membrane. But it's a process. You've got to cut through that, you've got to get the insulation out of the way, then you've got to cut through the decking itself. long. It's long. Even after being on that training for weeks and seeing how it's done, you have to go up there and know what you need to do, and that's not realistic. You're still right at 10 minutes.
So when we get to the ventilation section, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So. Offhand, I can't think of any of true Type 5 construction for strip malls in Aurora, but there may be, and if there isn't today, there could be tomorrow, so just be aware of it. So, yeah, commercial roof, either metal or some kind of wood decking on there, and then all these layers, and that foam insulation just basically creates the slope. No flat roof is actually flat. They create a slope for drainage. They use that insulation. So on a strip mall, yeah, you probably are pretty limited. 4 to 16 inches would probably be the worst you'd run into. You talk about a big box, which we'll talk about later, and sometimes it's a couple feet thick to create enough slope on that big of a roof surface. And then, like I said, you run into metal decking, they have wood underneath there, all kinds of stuff. Sometimes they put multiple layers of like a rubber membrane on top of each other because they've had roof leak issues and stuff, so you can really run into a mess up there pretty quick that's going to be time consuming for what you're trying to do. And there it does to say, talk about all of that's, the tar and gravel and the rubber membranes and stuff, that's all flammable. And so is the styrofoam or the foam that they use for that slope. So all that can be burning just from, that metal deck can get hot enough from the bottom that it can ignite the rubber and the insulation above it. So you really, without actually penetrating that metal deck. These are becoming kind of made to come back, these SIP panels. Haven't seen too much of it in commercial structures yet, but it's a quick, easy way to build a structure and do the infill even between the structural components. So we'll probably see these more and more. So with these interior walls, you run into basically 3 types. So you've got your partition wall. This just goes up and touches the drop ceiling above. Just a quick, easy way to divide up a bigger space for multiple occupancies. The fire partition is supposed to run to the actual underside of the roof deck. Again, that's the initial plan, but new construction, renovations, utility stuff getting put in or updated or anything, all has an impact on that. And depending on fire codes and stuff, it may or may not be fire stopped, or it may start out fire stopped, but with new penetrations, they may not follow through with that. And then you have your 2 fire walls. So these are your fire partition walls, so you can see you've got that basically corrugated roof deck there in the upper left corner, and there's a gap in between each one of those ribs. So smoke and fire are going to make their way through that into the next area. And then around the trusses there on the bottom left, same thing, that truss must, in a room like this, it's probably running across, so that fire partition wall goes up, and they just go around that truss. And so again, you've got an opening there. And when you think about your flow path stuff and everything too, you're basically focusing your heat and smoke and everything onto that structural member as it tries to move out and find lower pressure area, fresh air, all that stuff. So now you're focusing your fire and your heat on your structural members. So that's just a close-up of that. They just went in there and stuffed fiberglass insulation into those gaps, trying to control probably sound or air movement.
The canned foam.
What's that?
It made me think of the canned foam.
Yeah, and they make special caulking and stuff that has a fire rating, but it's expensive, it's hard to put in, that kind of stuff. So usually when somebody goes in and makes a repair or whatever, they just grab, something like that canned foam and just run it around. And yeah.
Does the building code require like a thing that comes to mind is like paint stores or something with like a high pleasantability fire load, something like that there? Does it require them to have any particular partition walls or firewalls built in place, or whether you can actually bring that kind of stuff in there? I think it's part of like a hazardous materials containment, into that?
I think it can. I think it depends on the how vigorous the code enforcement is in the city. It depends. You'll notice, like in a strip mall that had a Jiffy Lube planned when it was built, that section will be different, built differently, and with that kind of thing in mind. If somebody comes in and puts a paint store in a strip mall that didn't have a paint store when it was built, it's anybody's guess on what will be in there. Okay. So here's some examples of firewalls. A lot of times the only firewall you'll really see is between the strip mall and the anchor store on the end. Sometimes you'll see them, I'm trying to think. I live in Buckley where the Just Grilling and Starbucks and stuff is at kind of a right angle to the King Soopers. It kind of stair steps down with the slope of the property, and they actually have firewalls every like 3 or 4 units along there. But that is one that I've been up in, and they're masonry walls, and somebody went in there and actually hit those with a sledgehammer, broke out big holes, so you can crawl between the units through the firewalls. So it is what it is, but like Cap said, if you get on that safe side, get that ceiling open all the way to the deck, you'll at least know what you're dealing with, and even if there is a hole there, you know where to focus your attention to help hold that fire spread back. So we talked a little bit about truss orientation. Any questions with that? Like Cap said, just to reiterate, probably the biggest thing to just kind of put in your brain and just remember on any of these is whether you're going in for a fire alarm, smoke investigation, whatever, it's a really, really good idea to open up that ceiling and take a look. So obviously, if we go in for a fire alarm on a strip mall, we're not going to go in there and immediately slam a pike pole through the roof or through the drop ceiling and check the ceiling. They're not going to be really happy when they come out and go, I'm sorry, we burnt popcorn in the break room and you just smashed up a couple of their ceiling tiles. But there's nothing wrong with stopping there. Take the padded butt end of the pike pole and just gently lift up on the tile and take a look, because the Village Inn fire is a great example of that. They went in there, they were in there for 5 or 10 minutes with a ripping fire over their heads and had no idea. People were eating breakfast, hanging out, having a good time, and nobody had any idea what was going on. So just taking a look will help you. If you go into smoke investigation, same thing. Get that open up and use your best judgment. Be a conscientious firefighter and how aggressive you are in opening that up. But definitely take a look before you go walking deep into a store, following the manager back to the fire alarm panel in the back and not realizing that you got a good fire above you. Okay, with the facades, these actually pose a pretty big challenge and a pretty big risk to us. And we'll talk about a little bit more how you can adjust for that with your fire attack. But they run end to end. A lot of times that front wall of the store doesn't go all the way to the roof deck. It stops. So the trusses can go out and support the facade, or the facade can be hung on the front of the store. So you've got a free open space there where any fire inside that cock loft can get out the facade pretty easy. And then obviously it's going to spread laterally. So picture's a little bit hard to see, but does it make sense? So this is your drop ceiling. Here's the front of the store, and they've got a truss running across there. So their trusses are running laterally across the building, B to D. And so this truss has insulation packed in it, and there's a overhang and facade on the outside of that of the store. So you can tell if you got a fire that went up through that drop ceiling and started to spread out, it'd be in that facade almost immediately.
Is that cross member?
What's the question?
Is that cross member that's going left to right, is that a beam? What is that, going through the truss? What is that?
It's going through it either, probably just guessing from what we can see, either it's support for like mechanical or something that's hanging in there, or it's just sometimes they get creative and figure out that they can go with a smaller truss or greater spacing if they laterally support the trusses. And so it may be some kind of Band-Aid of lateral support for those trusses. I don't know, unless anybody else has another idea on it, but those are the typically like that. Yeah, that's just a closer look. Not sure. Has anybody ever been inside a structure that has a drop ceiling that's come down? It's a mess. It's scary. There's normally not enough weight to hurt you, but huge entanglement issue. It's scary because it feels like the whole building's coming down. I don't know if you're familiar, this whole grid is just hung on wires. They just hang wires off the trusses down and then hooks to the white strips that you see, and then they just drop the tiles into those.
Go back 2 pictures. Those wires are shown on that. Yeah, this is what's hanging your ceiling right here, all these.
So you can see how that would come down pretty quick in a fire. So if you get there early on a small fire and you decide to push inside, be aware that may be an issue for you. And then obviously on top of that, now you've got all the duct work, you've got mechanical maybe between that drop ceiling and the roof deck. It's not always outside. So you've got a lot of stuff up there that potentially, and again, that's not typically held up there very well. So if the ceiling comes down, then that duct work and mechanical is going to come down pretty quick after that also. So basically they're just talking about trying to get, we're just basically trying to get some water inside that facade if you start to have extension into it or the fire starts out in that facade, which is what happened with the Village Inn. They had a sign malfunction that caused a fire in the facade that actually spread into the structure, the opposite of what we normally think. Biggest thing always is to recognize that early and not put people or start operating underneath that facade if you're concerned that there's fire in there. So how would we know that there might be fire in our facade?
Take a
Pull
look.
Pull ceiling or
So take
cut a hole in
yeah.
it. Look
Okay.
for melting plastic.
Smoke.
Okay.
Small like can lights and stuff.
Okay, yeah. So just take a second and take a look and think about it and look at your signs. Cutting a hole in it may be something you have to do. Obviously, probably not your first choice or your starting point. But if you know you have a big active fire, then cutting a hole in the facade's not a big deal. Obviously, you gotta figure out how to do that without putting anybody underneath it. And so you're probably looking at doing that off of like an aerial or something like that. Or you have to move down far enough that you're confident that you can place a ground ladder against it, make your cuts, look in there, do what you can. Sometimes, depending on how big it is, sometimes you can pop the end of it, and then you have a pretty good shot the length of the facade. I've never done the saw cut. Have you seen it done, Pat?
On a facade?
Yeah.
I haven't seen it on a scene. I saw it at King Supers, and the surprise, you know, that last picture that had the facade where it's all more or less type 5, it's all wood. You might see that, or in the case of the King Supers, it was a big I-beam. So they took a saw to it and hit the I-beam. So, you know, cutting into it is what we had to do. You had to cut in the front of it, but you just don't know what's going to be behind there. It was not anything that was, you know, part of the building, truss construction extending out. It was more or less an independent facade that had a huge I-beam going through it. So think about two things: is you had to cut around it, but also if that collapses, that's not just, you know, an isolated collapse. It was bringing the whole facade down.
I probably shouldn't assume. Does everybody know what we mean by doing a saw cut on the facade? So basically the idea is, if you think of this table as your facade, I guess, if we came in and made a cut here, and there's fire here and there's no fire here, if this decides to collapse, the theory behind it is this will collapse, but it'll break loose if you're cut, and isolate the collapse. Since this is normally, the whole facade is normally tied together in the way it's constructed, and the ultimate example of that is an I-beam that runs end to end. If you have an isolated collapse here, it's liable to pull it all the way down. And so you may be 3-4 stores down from the fire, but if you have the facade collapse over here, it may drag the facade all the way to the end of the building down. So that's kind of a relief cut to stop that from happening. Any questions with that?
Just for a sec, because I might not be able.
Sure. You want to?
Sorry,
Yeah,
guys.
run
A
with it.
little bit into 2 minutes, I
Yeah,
apologize.
no, sorry.
I'll go back to that slide before we start talking about that. So your strip malls, what's our normal response for that? Anybody gone through that yet? It's okay if you haven't, but
Three engines, 2 trucks, 2
who knows, right?
It's still 2, 2, and 2.
Oh, it
You
is?
know, I mean, depending how pro QA signs it, right? But assuming that it's 2, 2, and 2, I mean, you have a confirmed fire, where do our resources need to go initially? So if you're the first engine on scene and you're taking command, where do you want to put the first engine, the first truck, the second engine, the second truck, the third engine?
Level 1 stage.
So level 1, so if you stage them and now it's ready to assign them, right? So level 1 stage means who's coming in?
Truck and an engine and a Jeep.
Right. And you'll go, which side will you go to?
Alpha side.
You go to the alpha side. So then you've got, if you look at this right here, let's go back. So that's your main fire unit. You set up on the alpha side. So then you've got confirmed fire, let's just say the red area and that whole unit, that's your fire. So then where do you want to put your resources?
Truck.
So you're the first engine and the first truck on the alpha side. So your second engine, you want to go where?
On the back.
Okay, and then where do you want your second truck to go?
Truck.
And what kind of tasks are they going to do on that backside?
Open the socks, open everything up.
So 4th century doors, get water supply, right, in case we go defensive, trucks in a spot where they can go defensive, trucks looking at the roof, right?
A lot of times the gas meters are in the back, so security.
Utilities, exactly. Okay, and there might be, with forcing So you're aware of that. And then if you're, that's kind of your horizontal ventilation if you're going to use it. But vertical vent, it's got to be coordinated, number one, and there just may not be time for it. So it might be one of those, like a trench cut that you're doing. Somebody was talking to me the other day about the Arcadia fire. Nobody see a video of that in California. They made a trench cut. I mean, it's a good aerial video where they make the trench cut. It actually overran the trench and they had to go make another trench cut. But that trench cut might be your. If you're assigned to rehab, that's just right next to staging if there's room. But again, that's where your equipment complement is going to change, right? If you're rehab, then what kind of stuff are you bringing up? Still bring up a bottle. You never know what you got to do, right? But you're going to bring up your med equipment. If you can, I mean, hopefully by that time there's an elevator that you can use, or you can shovel water if that's what you're going to need. So this is exactly, Jeff Keys was a second BC arriving, right? Mm-hmm. So he was assigned into Heather Garden, so that was appropriate. And he eventually at one point took over Division 6. So just be aware that you could be relieved by another officer as a division supervisor. You could actually be relieved by a BC that moves interior and takes over that. And then you would report to him. The management team will automatically respond, and they could assume any role to answer. Aaron, that was your question. So if an incident, get a question if the incident management team showed up, could they take over staging? And who knows? You know, I think there's enough tasks going around, probably around the command post. And like Cap said, if we have a big fire, we're probably going to be reaching out to mutual aid resources. We're going to be reaching out to city resources that might need to be coordinated. That staging is probably not on their list. Medical stuff is probably not on their list. So they're probably going to be busy.
How big of an operation would it have to be for us to use that and get it down in 15? It's more like Wildman, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Something that's
your
gonna be
request. I
hours
mean,
long.
yeah.
The biggest issue is getting it there in a timely fashion.
So if we have multiple organizations coming, is that when you would utilize it, or? I've never seen it used.
I don't think we ever have it.
Yeah,
We
this
used to
is-
use it
The
at the
theater
time.
shooting?
By the time we were going to use it, it was over.
Well, they only have it at the gas department.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They
he
did,
uses
didn't
it
they?
Yeah,
for
we
his
had it out
hours
there.
and stuff.
Yeah.
We were out there for like 2 days.
Yeah.
Who deploys it? Like, who drives it? Can we drive? We don't have anybody that can drive it, right?
Certainly.
I mean,
Sure, probably bring it or somebody, but somebody pick it up.
I think PD has to bring it. I
Yeah,
don't
'cause
think we
there's-
have really access to it.
yeah, it's some kind of different driving that's required for it.
I don't know. I've never seen an AFR person drive it, or even practice driving it, so.
Because it's a whale.
They have precise little.
Were you guys empowered to drive it at 13s?
I rode in there, and like I said, we did brake checks, we started it up, went through all the brake and lights and everything else, I would imagine we could. Haven't heard that we couldn't.
Yeah.
Just don't
Again,
crash.
probably not something.
You'll be fine.
It basically is an acting officer, it might be something, I mean, you get a good fire in one of these structures, and it's cold out or something, might be something to just throw out to the IC as a suggestion, but you won't, I wouldn't worry too much about ordering something like that.
You're obviously used to IC charts by now. You know, I'd worry about the operation side at this point. And maybe, you can worry about logistics and you might be assigned rehab or med branch. But I would just worry about groups and divisions, getting your accepted practice.
I think with all of these, the biggest thing is just understanding kind of that first alarm assignment, so you know what, as you're coming in, basically what you're supposed to do, and then just taking in the information that you see and making good decisions with it. We were talking about just fire attack in general, but there is no black and white, right or wrong answer to any of this. And that's what makes it kind of fun, but also most challenging. Like we talked about, generally if you're first in, you're going to that fire floor. Check the panel, go to the fire floor. But if there's a bunch of people injured, maybe you make the decision that you're going to start EMS for these people. Maybe you're going to just focus on evacuation. Maybe you decide, you know what, there's that weird research building that university won't even hardly let us walk into. You show up and they go, nope, we got it. You just stand outside and wait for them to tell you it's okay. They handled the problem. Maybe you just go, you know what, I don't know what's going on up there, but it looks bad, so we're going to park over here and supply the FTC and keep those sprinklers doing their thing up there, because it's not safe for us. There's a million directions you can go with it. Just make good decisions, kind of what the general game plan is, so once somebody starts it in that direction, or you start in that direction, you know what those first units are going to do. And that's all the way down to the task level. I think some departments have gone to something where nobody can operate above the fire floor. Or nobody's supposed to be above the fire floor until you have a line operating on the fire floor. And that came from, New York had a couple firefighters that got killed maybe, 5-10 years ago. Some of that stuff. I think the reality is it's up to the officer to make a good decision. You pull up there and there's smoke pushing through around that door, and the door looks like it's starting to form from the heat and stuff. Yeah, you may want to just lay your line out on the floor below, get as straight as you can. Yeah, it's going to be a heck of a pull to get that up the stairs and onto the fire floor, but that's the right thing to do. You get there, it's a good solid fire door. You're not seeing a lot of smoke pushing around it. The door's not hot. There's no reason why you can't flake that hose up above and back down like you were taught in the academy. It's just about making those good decisions and having that thought process for it. Make sense?
I think, remember, a big part of being an officer, everything's, you gotta make decisions. Sometimes depending on your crew, you just gotta get out of the way and facilitate. So you don't have to be the guy or the girl that has all the answers. You've got people on your crew that you can lean on in a situation like this, then you just got to facilitate. You got to communicate on the radio. You got to communicate a plan, and kind of just let the train roll down the hill. It's not that doesn't have to be everything through you. You just got to make sure it's going the right way, but you don't have to control everything. Does that make sense?